The desert stretched endlessly under a burning sun, its silence broken only by the sound of shovels piercing the dry earth. For years, teams of archaeologists had combed this forgotten land, searching for fragments of civilization swallowed by time. Most days yielded little more than pottery shards or fragments of bone that told familiar stories. But on that particular morning, something different surfaced from the dust, something that would not fit the known order of history. As the sand gave way beneath their careful brushes, the outline of a skeleton began to emerge, yet from the first glimpse, it was clear this was not the skeleton of a man. The bones protruded from the earth with a strange geometry. The skull, elongated and narrow, reflected the sunlight with an almost metallic sheen, as if age itself had hardened it beyond ordinary decay. The archaeologists leaned closer, whispering to each other, their faces caught between curiosity and dread. This was not what they had been trained to expect. The human skeleton had a rhythm, a familiarity that echoed through textbooks and excavations alike. But what lay before them broke that rhythm entirely. The proportions were all wrong. The rib cage seemed compressed in a way that defied biology, the arms longer than they should have been, the joints bending in unfamiliar directions. It was a body, yes, but not a human one. The leader of the team, a seasoned archaeologist who had spent decades unearthing the dead, froze as he examined the emerging form. His mind wrestled with two truths that refused to coexist: that these bones clearly belonged to a living being once, and that no record in science described such a being. He whispered under his breath, almost to himself, "This is impossible." But the desert has a way of silencing certainty, and before long, even the word impossible seemed too fragile for what they were witnessing. A few steps back, one of the younger researchers snapped photographs, his hands trembling as he captured every angle. The lens caught details the eye could easily miss. Tiny markings etched into the surface of certain bones, almost like scars, almost like symbols. The discovery was not simply archaeological. It felt ceremonial, as though something had chosen this precise moment in history to resurface. After more than 3,200 years of silence, the desert had given back a secret that science had never been prepared to face. Night fell quickly over the site, and with it came an unusual heaviness. A skeleton, now partially unearthed, seemed to radiate an aura that pressed against the air. The workers moved slower, as if gravity itself had thickened around them. Some refused to continue until morning, muttering that what lay in the ground was better left untouched. Others, driven by the hunger for discovery, could not look away. A question lingered unspoken but palpable in every mind. If this skeleton was not human, then what was it? And more importantly, why had it been buried in a manner that suggested reverence, almost worship? The call of mystery had been sounded, and nothing would ever be the same again. The following day, as the sun rose with its merciless heat, the excavation resumed under a veil of unease. The skeleton lay partially exposed, its strange proportions etched into the minds of everyone present. Each stroke of the brush revealed more of its alien geometry, and with every inch, the feeling that they were trespassing deepened. It was not just the discovery of bones. It was as if they had crossed an invisible threshold into knowledge that had long been forbidden. The skull, now fully visible, dominated the attention of the team. It was impossibly elongated, with cavities that suggested senses unlike any creature documented in biology. Where human eyes would have sat, these sockets extended further back, giving the impression of a vision that could pierce beyond the ordinary. The jaw was narrow, tapering into a shape that did not belong to any branch of humanity or known animal lineage. One of the researchers placed his hand against his own face instinctively, as though to reassure himself of his humanness, while staring into the hollow gaze of what clearly was not. As they dug deeper, more anomalies surfaced. The rib cage was small, almost compressed, yet the spinal column extended longer than it should, giving the figure an unsettling stature. Its hands, if they could be called that, were uncovered next, and gasps rippled through the trench. Each limb ended in elongated phalanges, slender and almost delicate, yet tipped with bone ridges sharp enough to suggest either adaptation or design. They did not seem like instruments of survival. They seemed like instruments of precision, tools in themselves, as though this being had once manipulated the world in ways human hands never could. The silence among the archaeologists thickened, broken only by the rustle of brushes and the nervous clicks of cameras. It was one thing to find something strange, but another to face a discovery that threatened to undo the very foundation of science. The whispers began to spread. Could this have been a genetic mutation? A ritual burial of a deformed individual? Or was it something else, something that history had concealed deliberately? The leader of the team urged caution, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he could not ignore the reality staring back from the sand. At one point, a worker recoiled suddenly, dropping his tools. He swore that as he brushed away the dust from the sternum, the ground seemed to tremble faintly, as though the earth itself was resisting the act of exposure. Superstition clashed with reason, yet in that moment, no one could dismiss his fear. It was as though the burial carried not just bones, but a warning. By sunset, the skeleton was nearly complete, its otherworldly form undeniable. Laid bare under the fading light, it seemed less like a relic and more like a presence, as if awakening after millennia of slumber. No one dared to speak aloud what everyone was thinking, that this was no longer a simple excavation. They had encountered something that did not belong to them, something that perhaps they were never meant to see. And in the stillness of the desert, the forbidden nature of their discovery pressed against their hearts like a weight they could not shake. Long before this excavation, the desert had already earned its reputation as a graveyard of forgotten civilizations. Beneath its endless dunes lay the ruins of cities erased from memory, temples swallowed by shifting sands, and inscriptions half broken by time. Yet none of those remnants had ever suggested the existence of what now lay uncovered before the archaeologists. To make sense of the impossible skeleton, the team began to search for context, digging not only into the earth but into the archives of ancient history. The region had once been home to a flourishing culture that thrived more than 3 millennia ago. Fragments of their myths, carved into stone tablets and painted on pottery, spoke of beings who walked alongside them, beings they did not dare call human. Some legends described guardians of the threshold, figures who appeared during times of great transition, only to vanish again without leaving a trace. Others spoke cryptically of those who came from the stars and left their bones behind as warnings. Scholars had long dismissed these stories as symbolic allegories, the poetic exaggerations of an imaginative people. But standing over a skeleton that clearly defied biology, the line between myth and history blurred into uncertainty. One archaeologist, a specialist in comparative mythology, retrieved an old text from her notes. It contained references to a ritual of reverence, where the dead were buried not as individuals but as vessels of power, their remains guarded as sacred relics. She pointed out that the skeleton's resting position mirrored those rituals almost exactly. Its limbs had been folded with care, the bones aligned as though placed intentionally rather than left to decay. This was no accident. It was not the disposal of a malformed body. It was a burial, deliberate and ceremonial, designed to preserve memory or to conceal it. As the team discussed these findings, the weight of history pressed on them more heavily than the desert sun. If this skeleton connected to the myths, then what had been dismissed as stories might in fact have been testimonies of encounters long forgotten. That possibility forced the researchers into uncomfortable territory. It meant that history had been edited, shaped to erase chapters that did not conform to the narrative of human progress. And if this erasure had happened once, how much else might have been lost? The discovery also raised another question. Why here, and why now? For over 3,200 years, the sands had guarded this secret with unyielding silence. What shift in fate or chance had allowed it to resurface in this century? Some suggested coincidence, but others, more unsettled, felt there was intention in the timing, as though the Earth itself had chosen this moment to reveal the truth. Whatever the reason, the team could no longer deny the gravity of their find. It was not only science they were confronting, it was the collective memory of humanity itself, resurfacing like a ghost that refused to stay buried. The skeleton, carefully lifted from its sandy tomb, was transported under strict preservation protocols to a research facility miles away. For the archaeologists, the excavation had ended, but for the scientists, the real story was just beginning. In sterile white rooms, under fluorescent lights that stripped away the mystery of the desert night, the bones were laid out on stainless steel tables. Yet even in this clinical setting, the strangeness of the specimen could not be diminished. Every measurement, every scan, every attempt to classify it only deepened the enigma. The first anomaly was size. Though incomplete, the skeleton suggested a being taller than any average human of its supposed time period. Its elongated limbs indicated not only height but proportions beyond the norm of known physiology. The skull, subjected to 3D imaging, revealed internal cavities that had no parallel in human anatomy. Structures within the cranium hinted at sensory capacities far beyond ordinary vision or hearing. One researcher remarked in hushed disbelief, "This wasn't made for our world." His words, though unscientific, echoed the private thoughts of everyone in the room. Next came the radiocarbon dating. Samples of the surrounding soil confirmed the burial dated back roughly 3,200 years, consistent with the archaeological record of the region. Yet the bones themselves, when analyzed, presented a paradox. Their mineral composition suggested exposure to preservation techniques unknown to ancient peoples, as if the body had been prepared using methods outside the reach of human knowledge at the time. The question was no longer only what this being was, but how it had been buried with such sophistication. DNA extraction followed, the step that was supposed to deliver certainty. Instead, it produced confusion. Partial strands were sequenced, but instead of matching Homo sapiens or even closely related primates, the results were fragmented, irregular, and laced with sequences that did not correspond to any known species. Some sequences repeated in patterns that looked almost engineered, as though designed rather than evolved. The team grew restless. If the data were accurate, then they were not studying a freak mutation of humanity. They were facing something else entirely. Debate ignited within the lab. Some argued contamination had skewed the results, insisting the impossible could not be accepted. Others, shaken but honest, whispered that the findings could not be explained away so easily. A clash of worlds unfolded, the safety of scientific orthodoxy against the disruptive force of a discovery that shattered its foundation. In the middle of it all, the skeleton lay silently, a mute witness to the limits of human knowledge. As the hours stretched into days, the pressure mounted. Reports had to be written, conclusions drawn, funding justified. But how could one write about a being that, by every measure, should not exist? The scientists knew that their decision would echo far beyond academia. If the truth was revealed, it could unravel centuries of certainty. If hidden, it would become yet another secret buried in the vaults of history. Either way, the skeleton had already succeeded in doing what no fossil or artifact had done before. It had forced science to confront the possibility that it did not have all the answers. While the scientists struggled with their data, a parallel investigation began to unfold in the realm of history and myth. If the skeleton could not be explained by biology alone, perhaps the past itself had left hidden clues. A historian on the team, drawn to the unusual inscriptions found near the burial site, began to cross-reference them with ancient manuscripts stored in archives around the world. What emerged was a pattern of stories that, though separated by centuries and cultures, seemed to echo the same forbidden memory. The inscriptions recovered at the excavation site were faint, nearly erased by time. Yet under careful restoration, they revealed symbols that did not belong to the known language of the region. They appeared to be hybrids, part pictograph, part phonetic script, as if the writers had struggled to record something beyond their comprehension. When translated, the words were fragmented but chilling. They spoke of visitors cloaked in flesh not like ours, and keepers of the hidden gate, who walked among men when the stars were aligned. The text warned that their return would signal an upheaval of order, a moment when human knowledge would be tested and judged. Intrigued, the historian expanded her search. In dusty monasteries and forgotten libraries, she found scattered references to beings whose descriptions matched the form of the unearthed skeleton: elongated skulls, limbs too long, eyes that could see the currents of time. These accounts had always been dismissed as myth, woven into folklore as metaphors for gods or spirits. But when compared side by side with the excavation findings, the similarities were undeniable. Myths, it seemed, were not inventions. They were memories distorted by distance, carrying fragments of truth through generations. One manuscript, written more than 2,000 years ago, described a burial ritual eerily similar to the one uncovered. It spoke of placing the guardian in the earth, not in death, but in silence, until the appointed hour. This single line struck the team with a force stronger than any scientific data. Could the skeleton have been intentionally buried as part of an ancient covenant, waiting to be revealed at a destined time? If so, the timing of its resurfacing after 3,200 years was not coincidence, it was prophecy unfolding. As the pieces came together, the whispers of these ancient texts grew louder, weaving themselves into the narrative of the discovery. The skeleton was no longer just a body to be studied. It was a message inscribed into the very soil of history. But messages are meant to be read, and some messages, once deciphered, can never be forgotten. The archaeologists and historians realized they were not simply uncovering bones. They were unsealing a chapter of human existence that had been deliberately hidden. A chapter that threatened to rewrite everything we believe about who we are and where we come from. In the quiet of the archives, surrounded by manuscripts that seemed to pulse with renewed life, one truth became impossible to ignore. The ancients had warned us. We simply had not listened. The deeper the research went, the heavier the burden became. Inside the sterile walls of the laboratory and the dusty halls of ancient archives, two worlds were colliding: the rigid discipline of science and the elusive whispers of myth. What had once seemed separate, the measurable and the mystical, was now converging in a single discovery. But with convergence came conflict, and it was not only intellectual, it was moral. Within the team, debates turned into arguments. The younger researchers, unburdened by decades of academic caution, argued passionately that the truth must be revealed, no matter how disruptive. If this changes everything, one of them insisted, then it is our duty to let it change. To them, the skeleton was proof that humanity's story was incomplete, that the boundaries of what we know must be redrawn. But the veterans in the group were not so certain. Their voices carried the weight of careers built on established paradigms, careers that could be destroyed in an instant if they dared to publish findings so unorthodox. For them, the skeleton was not an opportunity but a threat and uninvited guest that had arrived to dismantle lifetimes of certainty. Outside the team, pressure grew. Rumors of the discovery had begun to leak, reaching ears that were never meant to hear them. Representatives of academic institutions demanded reports, urging restraint and responsible communication. Funding organizations issued veiled warnings about consequences if results were exaggerated. Even whispers of government interest surfaced, hinting that forces beyond science had a stake in whether this truth was revealed or buried again. The skeleton had become more than an object of study. It was a catalyst, igniting fear in those who thrived on stability. And yet, no amount of pressure could erase the questions that now burned in every mind. If this being had lived among humans, what was its role? Was it a guide, a guardian, or a threat? Had ancient civilizations interacted with it willingly, or had they feared it? The myths and inscriptions suggested reverence, but reverence could be born of awe or terror. The conflict was not just external, but internal. Each researcher felt torn between awe and fear, between loyalty to truth and loyalty to the structures that had shaped their lives. In late-night discussions, voices trembled with the weight of the dilemma. Some argued for silence, for sealing away the evidence until humanity was ready. Others countered that such secrecy was the very reason humanity had remained in ignorance for millennia. To hide the skeleton would be to repeat the mistakes of the ancients who buried it. To reveal it would be to risk plunging society into chaos. Either choice was a gamble with consequences no one could fully imagine. In the end, one fact loomed undeniable. The discovery had already shattered certainties. Even if the bones were hidden, even if the findings were silenced, the people who had seen them would never be the same. Knowledge, once gained, cannot be unlearned. And in that realization lay the deepest conflict of all, not between myth and science, but between truth and fear. The breakthrough came quietly, almost by accident. In a late-night session at the laboratory, when most of the team had gone home, one researcher pushed further with the genetic sequencing. He adjusted the parameters, searching not for matches within the database of known species, but for repeating anomalies, patterns that might reveal themselves through sheer persistence. What he found froze him in place. The DNA strands of the skeleton did not merely differ from human, they displayed sequences so unusual that they seemed constructed, as if designed with intention rather than shaped by natural evolution. The following morning, when the team gathered, the results were shared. On the screens before them, lines of code-like patterns scrolled endlessly, segments that repeated in a symmetry rarely seen in organic life. "This is not random," the geneticist whispered. "It's structured." At first, the room erupted in disbelief. Some dismissed the data as contamination. Others demanded new tests. But the more they examined the samples, the clearer it became. The skeleton's genetic makeup was unlike anything on Earth. It carried within it the unmistakable signature of intelligence. The implications were devastating. If the data was accurate, this being was not a freak mutation of humanity. It was not an evolutionary branch that died out. It was something else, something that had no place in the known tree of life. The younger researchers were electrified, whispering words like extraterrestrial and engineered. The elders recoiled, unwilling to utter what their minds could not deny. The skeleton was not human, and its presence on Earth was an unsolvable contradiction. As the weight of this revelation settled over the room, silence stretched uncomfortably. One of the archaeologists broke it with a trembling voice. "Then the legends were true," she said, recalling the ancient texts that had spoken of visitors cloaked in flesh not like ours. The parallels between myth and science, once brushed aside as coincidence, now stood undeniable. Thousands of years ago, people had described exactly what lay before them, and now the evidence was carved into bone. But the revelation did not end with biology. Further scans revealed microstructures embedded within the bones themselves, tiny formations that should not exist in organic material. They resembled inscriptions, as though the body itself carried information, like a living archive encoded into its very frame. The skeleton was not only a being, it was a message left in silence for 3,200 years, now finally unearthed. The team sat in stunned disbelief. Science had always prided itself on explaining mysteries. Yet here was a mystery that explained science instead, showing them the limits of their own understanding. Some felt exhilaration, as if standing at the edge of a doorway into a greater universe. Others felt dread, fearing that they had trespassed into a knowledge meant to remain sealed. Whatever the emotion, one truth united them all. The world they thought they knew had just collapsed. The revelation could not be contained within the sterile walls of the laboratory for long. Whispers slipped through the cracks, carried by anxious voices and encrypted messages that traveled further than intended. Soon, word of the skeleton reached circles far beyond the team of researchers, circles that thrived in shadows and whose power rested on the control of information. The discovery was too dangerous to be left in the hands of a few academics. If the truth became public, it would not only rewrite textbooks but destabilize entire structures of power built upon the certainty of human uniqueness. Within weeks, subtle signs of outside interference began to appear. Funding agencies that had once encouraged bold exploration suddenly demanded reports written with measured conclusions. University officials hinted that publishing such disruptive findings could bring professional ruin. Strange men attended meetings uninvited, their presence justified vaguely as security liaisons. They never spoke much, but their silence was heavy, a reminder that eyes were always watching. The researchers realized they were no longer free to pursue the truth without consequence. One evening, as the team prepared to leave the lab, they found the main archive room had been entered without authorization. Files had been copied, some erased. Surveillance cameras showed nothing, yet the missing data was unmistakable. It was a warning. You are not in control of this discovery. The skeleton, once a scientific puzzle, had become an object of power, and those who coveted that power were willing to bend reality itself to keep it contained. Some scientists, terrified of losing everything, began to distance themselves, claiming the results were inconclusive or corrupted. Others grew defiant, insisting that the truth must be released before it was buried again, not under sand this time, but under silence enforced by authority. The fracture within the group deepened. Allies became suspicious of one another, wondering who might already have been pressured or bought. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, governments convened secret committees. The prospect of a non-human being buried among humans thousands of years ago raised questions too vast to ignore. Did this discovery prove the existence of civilizations beyond Earth? Or was it evidence of an ancient intelligence that had once guided humanity? Either answer was destabilizing, both to faith and to science, to politics and to identity. The official line was simple: the world is not ready. But beneath that justification lay fear, the fear of losing control. For the researchers closest to the skeleton, the sense of danger grew unbearable. They had uncovered something extraordinary, but in doing so, they had crossed into a realm where knowledge itself became a threat. In hushed conversations, they admitted what many now suspected: the discovery would not be published in full. Too many forces were aligned to suppress it. The skeleton would disappear into a secure vault, labeled and hidden, stripped of its context until it became just another artifact no one dared question. And yet, even under the weight of secrecy, a single truth burned in their hearts. Once seen, it could never be unseen. The hidden reactions of power could suppress papers, erase data, and silence voices, but they could not erase memory. The skeleton had already changed everything, and those who had touched it would carry its secret like a scar for the rest of their lives. The skeleton was no longer just an artifact of bone and dust. It had become a mirror one that reflected not only an ancient secret, but also the fragile state of humanity itself. For centuries, we have told ourselves that we are the center of the story, the pinnacle of creation, the sole authors of our destiny. But lying on that table, preserved across 3,200 years, was the evidence of something that shattered this comforting illusion. Whether it came from the stars, from another realm, or from a forgotten chapter of Earth's own history, the skeleton forced a question that humanity had avoided. What if we are not alone, and never were? The researchers, divided as they were, could not escape the personal reckoning. Some stared at the elongated skull and saw a threat, a reminder that humanity's dominion over the planet might be temporary, borrowed rather than earned. Others looked upon it and felt awe, imagining a lineage of beings that had once walked beside us, perhaps guiding our ancestors, perhaps observing our fragile attempts at civilization. To them, the skeleton was not a threat but a promise, that we are part of something larger, a story that stretches far beyond the boundaries of our species. The myths collected from ancient texts now seemed less like folklore and more like memory, fractured but persistent. Civilizations had described visitors with otherworldly forms, beings revered as gods or feared as demons. For generations, these stories had been dismissed as superstition. Yet here was the physical proof that such accounts might have been rooted in encounters too real, too overwhelming to record plainly. Humanity had chosen to clothe the truth in myth because myth was easier to carry than reality. But if this discovery was a mirror, what did it reveal about us now? The reactions of fear, secrecy, and suppression showed a civilization still ruled by the same impulses as the ancients, protecting order at the expense of truth. Perhaps that was the true warning encoded in the skeleton's burial, not simply that such beings existed, but that our response to their existence would determine our fate. Would we choose to embrace knowledge, however disruptive, or would we bury it again, silencing the questions that define what it means to be human? In the quiet moments, some of the team admitted to feeling watched, as though the skeleton itself still carried awareness. It was irrational, yet undeniable, the sense that those hollow sockets had once seen truths beyond comprehension, and that their reemergence was not random but timed. Perhaps the skeleton had resurfaced precisely because humanity had reached a threshold, capable of discovering, but not yet capable of accepting. In that paradox lay the heart of the mirror. It showed not only what we once encountered, but also what we are now fearful, curious, divided, yet still reaching for understanding. The skeleton had shattered the certainties of science, but in doing so, it offered humanity a chance to see itself with new eyes. Whether we would have the courage to look deeply into that reflection remained the question. The skeleton was sealed once more, not in the sands of the desert, but in the vaults of human secrecy. It lay in a sterile chamber, guarded by silence and by those who believed the world was not ready. Officially, it did not exist. No journal would publish it. No classroom would teach it. To the wider world, life continued untouched, as though the discovery had never happened. And yet, for those who had stood before it, brushed away its dust and stared into its hollow sockets, life would never return to what it had been. They had seen the truth, and truth cannot be unseen. But the greatest question remained unanswered. Was the skeleton a visitor from beyond, an ancient guardian, or something else entirely? The data offered no definitive origin. The myths gave only fragments. The silence of history stretched like an unbroken horizon. In that void, speculation thrived. Some of the team feared that revealing its existence could trigger panic, collapse belief systems, and destabilize societies already fragile. Others whispered that keeping it hidden was the greater danger, that ignorance leaves humanity blind, repeating the same mistakes, never seeing what watches from the shadows. What unsettled them most was not the mystery of the past, but the uncertainty of the future. If this being had walked the earth once, could it or others like it return? Were the ancient inscriptions warnings of a cycle, a pattern repeating across ages? And if so, had the skeleton resurfaced now not by accident, at a moment when humanity stood at a crossroads of destruction or awakening? The researchers often replayed their final days at the excavation site in their minds. The tremor felt beneath the sternum, the symbols etched faintly into the bones, the sensation that the burial was not simply interment but containment. Was the skeleton placed there to honor it or to lock it away? The distinction mattered, for one implied reverence and the other implied fear. If it was containment, then unearthing it might have been more than discovery. It might have been release. And so, The story closes not with certainty, but with a lingering echo. Somewhere beneath the hum of ordinary life, locked away where no one dares to look, lies the silent frame of a being that should not exist. Its presence challenges everything we believe about our origins, our place in the cosmos, and the limits of human knowledge. Perhaps one day the vault will be opened, and the world will be forced to confront what was hidden. Or perhaps it will remain forever in shadows, its truth carried only by whispers and by those few who once stood before it. In the end, Skeleton does not give answers. It leaves only questions, and perhaps that is its greatest power, to remind us that the universe is not ours to control, and that beneath the certainties we cling to, there are truths waiting patiently in silence, truths that, when revealed, will not just rewrite history, but shatter the very foundations of what it means to be human.